हा सगळा येईल. आता मी बोलतो ते पण यायला लागलं.
एक्सटर्नलच पाहिजे.
नाही नाही
एक्सटर्नल जोडले.
सॉरी, आता इंटरनलला आहे. आपण जोडलं एक्सटर्नल. आता
काहीतरी मशीन चालू फाईल डाउनलोड केलं.
I had a blast actually. My
Very nice.
sister, my nephew were there.
Oh, how nice.
We went and
They came, they're already here.
they were already here.
I see.
He is leaving from here to Netherlands. My nephew works
Nephew.
in ISG.
Ah,
ING,
ING,
sorry.
bank,
Bank.
yeah, yeah. Used to be bearing.
Yeah.
So today I'll be showing slides and
Sure.
discuss Monroe Prize. Should wait for some time, no? It's 11
Yeah,
o'clock?
it's not yet.
11
Five
already?
more. Is it? No, just 11.
Yeah.
Fine.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Really going well. We are Saturday, maybe we can have a group photograph and there will be some people, press people want to take feedback and put up and they'll interview you also. Saturday they are coming.
This Suhas Palchikar put me in touch with Shraddha Kambojkar, who said there's a heritage walk of Saturday.
Yeah, yeah. You can always take that.
But we'll teach, no, we'll be having class at, of course, that's Sankranti Day.
No, Sankranti Day we don't have a class. We already preponed it, right?
Okay, so
Already
that will be on
announced it also.
13th.
Heritage Walk is good.
Ah,
Even I thought we will go for a heritage walk and then we'll have a departmental dinner together.
oh, great,
We'll plan.
great. Meet everybody.
Now it's like too much of these things. Now you have sessions and then again you have to catch up after the lunch.
Yeah, yeah. No, I slept for 10 hours last night. I was so tired. I slept at 8 o'clock. Believe it or not, I slept at 8 o'clock. I woke up at 6:30, 6:40.
No, it exhausts you.
Yeah, yeah.
We think it's the physical, but even when you actually
Yeah.
think it exhausts you.
Yeah, yeah. Right. So should I just start?
Yeah.
Okay, let's start. I guess, should I wait? Are there people you know who are coming? Should we delay? Okay. So what I'm planning to do is to basically go over the Monroe Prize text, chapters 1 and 9, and then tomorrow we can discuss the background to it. We've been talking about questions that concern the kind of stuff that Monroe Prize is talking about. And can I ask, you had a chance to see the text? I know there's a lot of information to process. Yeah? Very good. Yeah. So, by way of preface, I'll repeat what I mentioned before, which is that law and media have generally been far apart. And I think reading this text, we understand that in fact, they could be very close together. And that always the assumptions about media concerned law, and what happened was when the equilibrium maintained during the Cold War was disrupted, then all those old assumptions had to be examined, changed where necessary, new regulatory structures put in. So the entire context of Monroe Price's text is the end of the Cold War, fall of the Soviet Union, opening up of new spaces for intervention, new kinds of assertion by states. Interestingly, Monroe Price only mentions the Cold War twice in the entire text. In other words, he doesn't want to discuss this is a strategy that many scholars adopt. You institute a breakpoint. Nothing before that you will talk about. Just too complicated. From that point forward, you'll discuss it. As we go through the text, we can consider to what extent that break is justifiable, to what extent we need to revisit the Cold War to understand what he's talking about. Okay. Any preliminary questions? Right. So I've essentially excerpted sequences of text edited from those chapters. I'll go over them and we'll discuss it. Yeah. So, in a time of global media interconnections, practices of broadcasting or of the internet in one state affect the political and legal climate of other states. Okay, sentence from chapter 1. Any comment? Okay, so fine. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Local advertising interests, they were required to be protected, so they imposed the very issue of tax which you brought in your introductory remarks.
Yes.
So the issue of tax was
Yes.
if Canadian advertising, if they are being broadcast, they would have tax holidays. And American media, they would be taxed. So that way they tried to save, but ultimately everything failed because then Paramount was taken over by CBS and all those things happened.
Yeah.
So similar kind of thing happened in India, and then of course I could refer to Dayatush's work, Murdochization of news, case of Star TV in India.
Yes, yes.
So similar thing had happened because Doordarshan, which was an apogee of the popularity, suddenly with the advent of private players, suddenly that popularity went away, and similar kind of thing happened. So again, if I could connect both the examples with what you were saying, obviously it's a global media interconnectedness, it's subjugated interest of the state.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
A little later, he also brought in Malaysian case studies. So similar thing happened in Malaysia.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter which part of the world you are, ultimately this globalization through media, it would bring in monocultural tendencies, as Stiglitz also said the same thing.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. Very good. All excellent points. My thought is, in a time of global media interconnections, so when do global media interconnections begin? Have they begun only after the end of the Cold War? No, they were there before that. Okay, you can say only broadcasting triggers the question of global. If there's no broadcasting, no triggering of the global category. But is that also true? There are restrictions on the import of print. There are taxes on. One of the first things that the United States, through the United Nations, did in the post-World War II period was to ban all taxes and all controls on the flow of information that every country had adopted. The United Nations adopted it as this is about freedom, this is about preventing fascism, this is about educating children, this is about creating a better world. No taxes on information, no controls on information. So in a sense, we could say that was an earlier moment of globalization, right? When and we can keep scrolling back to earlier moments also. But you know, it's a little arbitrary when we say this is when global media interconnections begin. No, it began from Columbus onwards. The ship is also a medium, sea is also a medium, you know, so on. You can go, keep going back. Right? How did Buddhism reach, you know, all those places? That was also so this notion of periodization is very important. How do you define a period? And you can, of course, For the purposes of study, you can say, I want to look at this period, this is how I'm defining it. But you're always able to question, okay, fine, but in this definition of period, you're leaving something out which is important. Why are you leaving it out? We have to be able to ask that question. In this case, since he's an American scholar, since he's an American Jewish scholar, since he's an American Jewish scholar whose book is being endorsed by Elihu Katz, leading communication scholar who developed the broadcasting system of Israel. He designed and built the Israel broadcasting system, yeah, I think through CBS, something like that. More questions come to our mind, but we can keep them in reserve. We can keep them in reserve. Okay. The division of national responses to the complexity of information inflows, complexity of information inflows into two categories or types. The first is the state's efforts to protect its own information space, its own bubble of identity against unwanted incursions. Okay, fairly quite clear. So he's taking the state as his unit of analysis. In a sense, what we tried to do was to say there is a global world order. Let us ask, what is this world order? That is not a question Monroe Price wants to. He brings it up in the very last page, the information order. In the last page, he brings it up. Here he's, he would like to treat it as market for loyalties. Individual states acting as like individual persons, all free and all equal, theoretically equal, competing with each other. That's the scenario that he's constructing for his understanding. Yeah? So this is often an act of defensiveness for the protection of valuable aspects of national identity, territorial integrity, national security, strengthening of citizenship. Okay, so now this way of understanding the state as essentially like an individual, yeah, like an individual. So the state has the same rights, the same need for protection that an individual might have. This dates from Immanuel Kant's late 18th century text, Perpetual Peace, where he made the argument that every state has rights, every state must be treated as sovereign, every state, when its rights are violated, it hurts other people. The very imagination, the very sight of another state having its rights violated hurts all other individuals in all other states. So that is the kind of scenario that Immanuel Kant, writing in an age of imperialism, yeah, and Germany was at that time just a network of, well, it had recently been reunified under Emperor Frederick the Great, but these were new understandings at that time, how to think about international law. And Kant's very influential solution was, we will think about international law by treating every individual state as like a human being. Okay? And for some purposes that analogy works, for some purposes that analogy may be inadequate. We should keep that in mind. Yeah? Any questions? The second category of the state to affect information inflow is the effort by a state or states to influence or alter media space and media structures outside its own boundaries or borders. Yeah? So on the one hand, the state tries to affect inside information flow. On the other hand, it tries to affect information flow outside. I use this distinction between state efforts directed inward and state efforts directed to other states to underscore my departure from a static conception in which domestic media space is the exclusive target of attention. This is very correct, and he's making a point here. Just by assuming that all our attention should be focused on domestic space, we are missing out on some important action that's going on. And of course, after the end of the Cold War, that became much more important. Why? Let me just pose that to you as a question. We've been discussing it for a while, but it'll be helpful to just recollect to ourselves what is the nature of the change going on here. I mean, may I say, part of this difficulty we have in answering this question is that we are all trained to think domestically. We are all trained to think within the space of the nation within which we are sort of born, are educated, and so on. We have to resist, our upbringing in a way, think in a larger term. But what we can say is the Cold War was a period of enormous geopolitical stability for a number of nations, not for all nations. Vietnam, there were hot spots, hot zones, but for countries like India, many other countries, the extent to which you could assume and rely upon regime stability, the extent to which both superpowers, US and USSR, wanted regime stability in the rest of the world, ensured that stability would be maintained. Yeah? They discouraged efforts to change the regime. So that was the kind of Cold War compromise. We don't want nuclear war, therefore we will take the status quo as fixed, therefore we will work to preserve that status quo. Anybody who attacks it, we will attack them. Okay, so it was not, in that sense, so spontaneous, so beautiful, so harmonious. Okay, there was a very serious political calculation underlying it. The most familiar category, one most associated with the debate over national sovereignty, includes states' unilateral efforts to control their own information space from undesired external influences. Okay, now let's just stop here. Can we think of an example in the Indian case? What might be an example of the Indian state trying to control its own information space? Okay, now the Indian state's own information space is also the information space of all of us in this room. Okay, so consider that point in all its complexity. Yeah? Can you think of any examples? That's right. And India has had more internet shutdowns than most other countries, and so forth. Yeah? And emergency. Yeah, emergency. Absolutely. That's right. So during the emergency, that's the most dramatic instance where we knew that information was being controlled, and yet the support for the regime during the emergency was actually very high. You should remember, all the 4 southern states voted for Congress in the 1977 elections, and the move of the northern Indian states away from the Congress was not simply a rejection of the emergency. It was part of the, once the elections were declared, censorship was lifted, and the media swung to an anti-Congress position. I'm not saying that's good or bad, just noting the mechanics, the dynamics of what was going on. Yeah? So this mood against the Congress actually developed in those few months, January to March, when the tables were turned. Yeah? So this question of a state wanting to control its own information space. So here, when you assume the state is like an individual, it is masking that complexity, that there's a lot of people within that own information space, which are themselves, not all singing the same song, so to say. Yeah, they may be conflicting with each other. Sorry? Sorry? Radio Ceylon. Yes. In,
songs.
indeed, that's right. That's
We
right.
often kind of immediately move to visual forms again. The broadcasting original kind of live, the fear of the contingent actually comes from radio.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And to this day, news is banned for radio, I believe.
Exactly.
That's-
I was coming to that point because one of the reason government is citing, because we have bandwidth, there are audiences also, there are private players ready to broadcast, so entire paraphernalia is there, but still government is not allowed because there is a surveillance issue.
Yes, yes.
Because what would happen in regional pockets, government has no mechanism to
That's
have
right.
a surveillance.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So they were prepared to sacrifice the chance of educating people better to ensure security and safety for itself. Most familiar category, one most associated with the debate over national sovereignty, includes states' unilateral efforts to control their own information space from undesired influences. Soviet Union's jamming of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty broadcasts. The realization that unilateral control over information space is weakening makes it more likely that there will be voluntary negotiations with states from which undesirable information originates. So again, this is the peacemaker Monroe Prize speaking, saying that there will be discussions, we will have, bilateral negotiations. Basically, no force, no coercion, it can be in a sort of law-like domain. That's his, there's a kind of optimism that runs through the book, but in the end, all the pessimism comes out, the last couple of pages, with a bang. Historically, international treaties or agreements embody such negotiation, though efforts in those areas traditionally have been quite unsuccessful. Okay, so you read it quickly, you can easily miss this. You can, the pessimism is buried within a much bigger optimistic statement. Examples of such agreements, the UN resolution of 1982 concerning direct television broadcasting would have encouraged consultation between broadcasting states and receiving states. Anybody know about this UN resolution of 1982? Yeah. This is a case where it is kind of astonishing how much there has been an erasure or a burial of what happened leading to this resolution of 1982, which is exactly what Herbert Schiller is talking about in his 1975 essay on information dominance, which is United States, which from the beginning of the United Nations had said, we want to have free flow of information. No country, no state should be able to restrict the flow of information because information is freedom. And this demand was made in a closed door meeting of the United Nations committees, and every single ally of the United States in Europe, the closest allies, this is the West, said, no way. We cannot accept free flow of information. We have just experienced fascism. We have seen the power of fake news and propaganda. We absolutely reject, this demand of yours. And there is a confidential memo which I found in the archives, National Archives in Washington, which said, we will not push the point now. We will withdraw it, but the implication was they're not deviating from the policy. We just won't push it now. Which is why when it came out again in 1975, and Schiller writes about it, it seemed like a surprise. But in fact, it was a constant. When it finally came to a vote in the UN General Assembly, every country in the world voted against the United States. It was all alone. And but the US media carried out a campaign saying this is a Soviet plot, All these poor, stupid third world countries are believing whatever they are told. And what will result if they allow this ability of every country to restrict information? Of course, dictatorship. They are just waiting to be dictators. And our information is blocked, then the freedom is blocked. Yeah? You will think this is a stupid argument, but it became very persuasive. So somebody like Anthony D. Smith, in an influential text called The Geopolitics of Information, he was the master of one of the colleges at Oxford, kind of illustrious career as a public intellectual and so on. He examined this debate and said, he took the side of the United States. That basically, these are all dictatorships in waiting, and the West. So it became now, in the course of the rejection of the US demand, the West came together through civil society, through campaigns in the public sphere, through media propaganda, etc., that the West must hang together because communism is lurking around the corner, and we have seen it and we don't like it. And Soviet Union is breathing down our neck and so forth. So this was part of in fact, it happened in the Reagan era. And the Reagan era saw a revival of the Cold War hysteria, that the big Soviet bear is waiting to attack us, and we have to build Star Wars, we have to build all these new missile systems to prevent them from taking over the world, which is kind of so unlikely at that time, so unlikely. It was very much propagandistic claim to support defense build-up and so forth. But according to this resolution, there were supposed to be consultations between broadcasting states and receiving states. It's not clear how much that was actually followed. Typically, the broadcasts were able to be received. Consultations were not necessarily carried out. States have turned to almost invisible contacts and informal negotiations for controlling their information space. Gives the example of the Kurdish population and the way Turkey tried to prevent them from having their own autonomous media, because Kurdish communication was a threat to, interpreted as a threat to Turkish identity, Turkish sovereignty. So new global channel service providers, competitors are much more dependent on agreements with states or with gatekeeper broadcast entities within states than is realized. Domestic structures are the pillars upon which global media systems are built. Very interesting. We should keep that in mind. Maybe it's true, but we should also test it. Like, how true is it? But of course, he's right. The television signals of CNN or BBC do not simply waft through the air before they invade the collective local consciousness. Interesting term, invade. Okay? There's a military ring to it, which will be confirmed again later. Today, to understand the actions of News Corporation, which is Murdoch, or MTV, competition between CNN and BBC World, we must look at the domestic pillars upon which they depend. Fine. Shall I pause here? Any questions so far? Marching through a lot of information. Yes.
Domestic pillars. So are we just talking about domestic infrastructure, or?
Yes, a domestic legal, basically domestic legal structures. What is allowed, what's not allowed. Some of the most known examples are between the receiving state and the large multinational private broadcasting firms. India, in an arrangement that soon fell apart, agreed to permit CNN to broadcast on a favored Doordarshan frequency if CNN agreed that the Indian broadcasting host would provide most of the news about its own domestic affairs. And you can see that that would have been in any case a difficult agreement to maintain. China made this agreement with that BBC would not be carried with News Corporation. Presumably, that also ran into some difficulties. So he goes on to say, we can think about this in terms of place and space. What he wants to say is, place is about something specific. It's like nation, right? Any territory which is, in the previous slide, he talked about the domestic space. So, place stands for domestic space in a way. Yeah, it's what can be rigorously controlled with specific laws, the Indian laws, Chinese laws, American laws. That's where place operates. Space is where the law is fuzzy, the law is blurry. You know, that's the international world. It's like outer space. Essentially, no borders. So, place is defined by its borders. Space is defined by no borders. That's the distinction. He's using that, you know, this couplet, these two terms, to kind of deepen the analytical scope of his argument. The opposing notions of space and place are markers for a dual perspective on the impact of technology on governments and their responses. They mirror, to a large extent, the contrast between multilateral approaches to regulating information and the more traditional national expectation. Okay, so when you have multilateral approaches to regulating information, that concerns space. That concerns that category for which the borders don't automatically exist. They have to be generated through multilateral agreements, negotiation, etc. Efforts to retain, reconfirm, and underscore traditional boundaries and establish notions of community can be characterized as contributions to the idea of place. You know, I come from this place, whereas you come from no place. You know, you're rootless, wandering, that kind of thing. Yeah? These efforts confront the challenge of the seemingly uncontrollable, alien, deconstructing and erasing ideas of space. Okay, so, and here it's not maybe irrelevant to, again, remind ourselves, this is someone who was forced to emigrate from Austria, from Hitler's regime as an infant, and, you know, this idea of the rootless Jew, you know, and then Israel is the solution, is the answer, place, and so forth. All of those may be there in the background. We can, you know, remind ourselves. By space, I refer to a model of activity that assumes that transmission of images can occur in a manner impervious to imposed public parameters or sanctions. Okay? This is actually the American desire, you should remember. They want to be able to broadcast without any restrictions. So in a way, he's standing apart from that also. He's not endorsing it, but it's not clear. In other places, he seems to endorse it. Here, law is removed to a set of principles only, a virtual admission that the ordinary machinery of government is ineffective. Okay? So what he's building up here is the need for thinking about information as a far more important category than the social sciences customarily grant it. Yeah? Because it goes on to say later, all of those other activities of the state depend on information, depend on the quality of information, the regulation of information, and in a sense, it is a highly under-analyzed domain in the social sciences. We can make that note to ourselves. Yeah? In this new configuration of transmission, there seems to be neither a fixed locus for enforcement or set of rules to be enforced. This idea of space captures a dream or nightmare where messages by individuals, groups, NGOs, transnational corporations compete unfettered by regulation in the distribution of images throughout the globe. Interesting that from information he switches to images. That's, you know, opening up something that he doesn't quite explain or explore. The idea of place is just the opposite. Is this visible? Should I expand it? Yeah. my use of the term here, I refer to the capacity of government linked to geography to maintain control over identity-related media and to have some influence over the mixture of language and imagery that is a significant aspect of the binding nature of the nation state. Again, you know, we cannot, we see the overtones of this argument. You might say the conception of nationalism that, say, Nehru had, to what extent was identity given this kind of overarching importance that Monroe Prize assigns it, is a question. Because whether it was Nehru, whether it was Tagore, there were many arguments that said, you know, there has to be a kind of cosmopolitanism. And it is because of that cosmopolitanism that when India was offered a seat in the UN Security Council, India said, no, China is more important. And they gave the seat to China. You know, that's not a standard nationalist response, but it was a conception of the world which assumed kind of, you know, that identity was not the most important thing. There was something about coexistence with your neighbors, which was very important. You can see some furrowed brows about that, you know. But just to say, the capacity of government to maintain control over identity-related media is saying that identity is the most important thing. And I think it's a question to what extent that theme is present in the Indian communication policy arguments. As far as I've been able to see, the identity question comes up when P.C. Joshi writes in the early 1980s, you know, something that Indian television must have identity. It's a late idea. It's not the early idea. Early idea is information, education, development, right? And it's in that sense much more, you know, non-exclusive, more ecumenical. Yeah. The history of broadcasting has been the struggle to domesticate frequency allocation to conform to those special ideas of place that are the state. International regulations and arrangements were designed, as the League of Nations sponsored convention concerning the use of broadcasting in the cause of peace put it, to implement national service of good quality within the frontiers of the country concerned. Okay. So now he takes up space and place in relation to sovereignty and globalization. Let me pause here. We've seen 17 slides. Any questions so far? Yeah.
So, basically, this is related to cricket broadcast rights.
Yes, 95.
Basically, there was this court case between ESPN Star, Z, and Prasar Bharati. That basically the rights were given to Z, and the eligibility criteria was that that any broadcaster having experience of over 10 years to broadcast cricket or any sporting event should be eligible to take those rights. But Z was saying that since we are new in the business, and of course we have broadcast cricket over a period of last 10 years on and off, but since we are Indians, we have rights over BCCI's cricket that has been broadcast in India. And that's the time this question was raised, that
Yes.
who owns BCCI?
Right.
So, or Indian team plays for India or BCCI. So the contention given by BCCI that Indian players, they play for BCCI and not India. So BCCI has every right to give cricket rights to the company which they think is competitive and fulfills all the commercial requirements. So I think that a concept of space was invoked in a way at that time, that those multinational corporations and their money was important at that time.
Yeah.
And That's how it happened.
And the court allowed this argument,
Right.
which is extraordinary, right? Yeah. Thank you for that point. Very interesting.
And, very recently, this BBC, they launched 5 language broadcasts in India,
Mm.
which is social media based or internet based.
Mm.
BBC was always there as BBC News or BBC World Service in India, and that broadcast happened from London or Singapore, or the broadcast was basically not based out of India.
Yeah.
But here in this case, Marathi, Bangla, I think Gujarati, Kannada and Telugu, I think these 5 languages, they started this service in if I'm not wrong, I think in 2017. And many of regular journalists, they joined these news organizations. And sometime in 2022 or 23, government realized that there is clear-cut violation of FDI norms.
Ah.
So government asked them to form a new company and carry out the operation. So the BBC formed a new company called News Collective, and now News Collective operates BBC in India
Is that right?
through the social media platform.
Is that
So
right?
that concept of state comes in. When the truth shown by all the news coverage by BBC became inconvenient,
Yeah.
the FDI norms issue was raised by state, and they were somewhere government tried to
Very interesting. Sorry. So how do FDI norms clash with state needs here?
basically the norms are that if you are in this news broadcast business or current affairs business, you are expected to have maybe majority stake should be with an Indian subsidiary or someone from India. And that was, since BBC was not operating in broadcast space per se,
Yeah.
they were not having any broadcast channel, but they were operating through internet. They had their YouTube channel and social media platforms. Government still felt it's broadcasting, so they need to have a Indian subsidiary. So they were asked to, either find an Indian subsidiary or shut down the business.
Right.
So they, they formed this newsmakers or news collective or something.
Right.
And then news collect under that ownership,
Yeah.
today BBC is operating in India, especially the language services.
Right.
So,
And of course, all the liberal press were against foreign direct investment that would exceed 49% or something like that. Yeah, it was seen as the last bastion of Indian sovereignty to have the press under Indian control. That was also part of this. Now the press is not so important. Right, sovereignty. Sovereignty describes the power of a state to make and enforce laws and to seek to have a monopoly of the use of force. Okay? So now this is a definition of sovereignty that we can say is in a direct line from the work of Carl Schmitt, yeah, which is to say, in the liberal democratic conception of the state, all of power is exercised through negotiation, accommodation, agreement, arrival at consensus, harmonious resolution of disputes and differences. And Carl Schmitt asked this question, who decides? If there's a problem, who decides? Okay, you are having all these, the disagreements can lead to a total impasse, but the state has to survive. It has to protect itself. If there is an emergency, who do you call, right? So, he conceived a very famous formula. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. The question of the exception is where the definition of what is normal, right, is experienced with the greatest intensity. The greatest intensity. And this idea of the exception tells us there is always going to be an exception. Logically, there will always be an exception. Who decides on the exception? It's the sovereign. Yeah? So there has to be some force entity that rises above this liberal, democratic, sphere of mutual discussion and negotiation. In other words, the force never disappears. The force is always held in reserve. And when it comes up, you may say, oh, terrible, and so on. But it has always been there. It has always been there. Yeah? Though all may desire it, there are few states that have absolute sovereignty, and most sovereigns have recognized or bargained away limitations on their power, both domestically and internationally. Yeah? So, for example, nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Many countries have said, we give up the use of nuclear power. And of course, they can change their minds, but that's one example of how states will agree to restrict their powers in order to enter into international agreements of various kinds. Yeah? Sovereignties are not fixed, even if for reasons of stability, the world order, again, one of the very few places where he uses this term, world order, often, and so you might say, if there is a world order, why don't you define it? What's its history? But it's not there. The world order often encourages the illusion that they are. Yeah? It is a characteristic of many states that their very destiny, the heart of their sovereignty, has been historically contingent upon a variety of economic, military, and other factors, domestic and international. Yeah? So fine. Yeah. Everything is historical. Everything is subject to change, even if the projection is there is never change. In the modern era, evolving ideas of national identity modify traditional notions of sovereignty. Under challenge in particular is the intense and long-standing idea that a convergence of sovereignty and identity is optimal. Yeah? Very interesting. Yes? Altered versions of self-determination spring from this challenge, with newer forms of autonomy related to the control of imagery or access to imagery, rather than to older, boundary-configured ideas of sovereignty. So you can all see it. Can I ask any questions about it? Any comment? How do you understand it? Is it intelligible? What would you say? Or can someone tell me what is he saying? Convergence of sovereignty and identity is optimal. That is, it is needed. There should be a convergence of sovereignty and identity. How can we understand that? Maybe one way to understand it is to think of a context where sovereignty and identity did not converge. What would such a context be? Can you think of one? As someone who has lived in the United States, I can say, the whole question of states' rights certainly complicates this, convergence of sovereignty and identity, because the passion with which states' rights were defended, of course, it led to the Civil War. There is a sizable body of opinion in the United States which would resist the notion that the federal government can decide what the state identity can or should be, or what the state can or should do. A sizable body. That's one example. We can think about, say, the British Empire, yeah, which existed until not so long ago. Yeah, and if you look at the British Empire, maybe not exclusively the British Empire, sovereignty and identity did not converge. You are Indian, other fellows, Ceylonese, other fellows Burmese, other fellows, Mauritian or some other, there was a shared sovereign. Yes, the British Emperor was the shared sovereign. There was a system of law which guaranteed you the rights of membership in the British Empire, which people could be proud of. Gandhi was proud to be a citizen of the British Empire. Yeah, he just wanted there to be some consistency in the way the laws were applied. Yeah, so that is, the empire is one example that is right before us, which we all are familiar with, where sovereignty and identity do not converge. Now you can say that's wrong, that's bad, we fixed that, we've got the right, answer to that problem. But it creates new problems, of course, right? When you have convergence of sovereignty and identity, it means everyone should have the same identity, which mirrors that of the sovereign or aligns with the identity proposed. But what if that doesn't happen? There can be, of course, tensions, and you could say, rather than constantly resisting the pre-existing identity's tendency to assert themselves, it's more economical, it's more efficient for different identities to prevail, given some common set of rules, common set of norms, which are imposed, which are regulated, applied strictly. Yeah? Only to say this convergence of sovereignty and identity can go a lot of different ways. Just to open up that question, and therein lies what political scientists call the issue of federalism. Yes, there's a federated structure, which India is supposed to have too, right? The South will have, may resist Hindi, North may have another view about it, etc., etc. Yeah, that's a federated structure, which in a sense the empire, for all of its problems, assumed a federated structure, you could say. Yeah, and nationalism, especially under the new information regimes, so it's a question of the information regime, drives a tendency for sovereignty and identity to converge, to have this idea that such a convergence is understood as optimal. Yeah? So what's interesting in Monroe Price is he's relating it to changes in technology. Yeah? Altered versions of self-determination spring from this challenge with newer forms of autonomy related to the control of imagery rather than to the older boundary configured ideas of sovereignty. Okay, so yes.
I was wondering how this works in contemporary American context, because the idea of on one hand, a lot of people call Donald Trump nationalist,
Mm.
but he's also extremely invested in the decentralization of a certain kind of certain arms of the government to the states.
DOG.
So how is it that, so for example, he wants to completely get rid of the existing structure of the FBI, he wants to completely delegate all education, which is a very, very important, in the nationalist project, education, a centralized idea of what education is an extremely important project.
Yeah.
He wants to delegate it out of the states. So abortion rights have already been
Yes.
delegated to the states. So I'm just wondering how this paradox, because a lot of this is in the American context.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how this paradox plays out in academia versus, in politics.
Bringing up academia, that's too much too much in one question. Now, in the case of Donald Trump, there's many things that he has said which, he often puts forward ideas which are internally contradictory, and he doesn't try to resolve them. And in a way, that's almost been his style of governance, to allow for disruption and to let the best, whatever it is, whether it's through force or through charm or persuasion, come forward. That's been his approach. He is comfortable with levels of chaos that few recent presidents have, been comfortable with. That's clear. What I'm most sort of interested in here is the extent to which control of imagery has acquired, an importance that it did not have before because of the problems posed by new technology and the capacities of new technology to penetrate boundaries in a way that states can no longer control or regulate. In that process, um, the likelihood of coercive, surveilling attitudes over information imagery are just going to escalate very, very steeply. Yeah? So rather than say this is a passion for, conservatism, we are all wanting the strong man, there's a much more clear, much more simple explanation that's available here, right? You can say dangers brought up by new technology and responses to these dangers, yeah, which is, cuts a lot of the myth making out. Yeah? On
On what Elon Musk is doing, because that is very much about the control of the image.
yeah, yeah,
Sensors, even now,
yeah,
yesterday Facebook has also said we are also going to some
yeah. No content moderation.
backtracking, so that news is out.
That's right. That's right.
So,
Yeah, I mean, one thing we have to say is that there is a short-termism built into all of these decisions, which even an ordinary person can see. It takes no genius to notice that. That 2 steps down, what will happen, nobody knows. It's all responses to immediate situations. They need to, manage Trump. So whatever Trump wants, he gets. Yes.
2018, the telecom Indian authority given the rules regulation for if you want to operate the OTT platform in India. So like Netflix, we have in 2016 in India. Parallelly, we have in domestic OTT platform like Planet OTT or Badiga, which are running over here. In 2018, there was a rule, and Indian government has prescribed that you have to take the permission if you are going to broadcast the content in the entertainment content. So it was not a news content, entertainment content. You are going to broadcast in India, you need to take the permission related to business and all these things. But after the pandemic in 2021 and 23, so the PTA and the Indian government broadcast declared that, and they are now entertainment. They don't need to take the censorship and other permissions regarding that. So what do you think? Is it especially the domestic rights, because those who are from the regional area, they need to take the permissions for the business and the broadcasting and everything. But the Netflix and Amazon from which are coming from the outside, they don't need because already they are on this one. So,
I'm not, I don't know enough about it, but I am aware that when Netflix does not offer the same content here in every country, that there are restrictions that, so this is something Monroe Price refers to, that there can be secret agreements or, not non-public agreements that are arrived at, which for the terms of which are not transparent to users. So I don't know why certain films are not available in India that are available. It's not clear to me that there's a, immediately discernible reason for that. But obviously, even if they're allowing Netflix, there's, that's not the whole story. That much is very clear. But you're posing an interesting question, then. Subject for research.
That is what housing gaming says, because they expect it's another version of the community notes. So essentially, you delegate your censorship duties to concerned citizens or discerning citizens who would then object. And in a lot of cases, this has actually happened, that they have published. So, for example, the recent series IPS 14 came out. There was no action directly by the government. Activists petitioned the government to take action. Then there was a disclaimer added that these are code names. The terrorists used Hindu code names, so it's kind of this is not really implying that the terrorists were Hindus.
Yeah.
But they did do the they are sticking to the facts. That and again they did add that all of this is fiction, etc. That kind of disclaimer is already there. So I think I think they figured out a way to kind of bypass seeming like the all-controlling puppet master, while actually kind of doing that, but making several puppet masters.
There are certain preventive measures that, not only as a follow-up to, like you said, citizen censorship or complaints, yes, that's a part of it, but then Netflix or like certain commercial, very, very big OTT platforms have their policies on acquiring certain kinds of content, and they will not acquire certain kinds of content in a particular country, given the legal framework. And I have spoken to people from Netflix who have said that this is not the kind of content we will buy. This is simply not the kind of
Referring to what?
referring to any kind of sensitive content, like different particular documentaries, for instance, of filmmakers who make certain kind of content. So it's just not in their policy in this country.
That's right.
So-
So much for free flow and all.
So very, very kind of pertinent example of this is the Bhakra Banerjee's piece.
Which piece?
Peace. Peace means 30.
Okay.
So it was actually produced by Netflix, but they have not released it. He's taking the film privately around festivals.
Oh.
They've not even allowed him to take it from them, to kind of send it on his own journey in festivals. They are very, very, they've been very, very tight with it. I mean, because of its content, because it follows a Muslim family through 30 years of Indian history, the recent 30 years of Indian history. So, and it actually goes into the future, which is what is the most dangerous part of the film apparently. It goes into 2040.
Right. Okay. So here we are. Media influence what constitutes the rational, the efficacy of power, and the strengthening or weakening of cultural bonds. Okay, so that's just, let's say, an enormous power that he's identifying very quickly in one sentence. Yeah, it constitutes the rational. Imagine, they constitute what you regard as reasonable. Yeah, the efficacy of power, the strengthening or weakening of cultural bonds. If Wilbur Schramm read this, he will say this is a hypodermic model, sorry, but here a sober legal theorist is utilizing this argument. To the extent the state depends on the consent of the governed, media are effective for persuasion and consensus building. Okay, so again, so much for the no effects model. Now, I just want to remind you that no effects model was strictly for the consumption of, domestic scholarship in the United States, because the very same scholars, such as Wilbur Schramm, who repeatedly argued, no effect, don't worry, don't waste your time. The same scholars argued for media for development communication. Okay? Development communication is strong effect. So in a way, the end of the Cold War, they started to acknowledge the arguments for the third world were also relevant for the first world. Yeah? That's when they could make the admission that previously they were not able to admit that media have strong effects. Globalization means, at bottom, the increasing tendency toward the incapacity of the state to maintain control over the shape and mix of images. That's an interesting definition. You rarely see it defined in that way, and I think this is a useful definition. Yeah? Globalization means that the potential of the media to buttress the identity of the state and its inhabitants is altered. Globalization means that the cultural bonds and loyalties that seemed once to be within the control of the state are now less so. So sovereignty is undermined. In other words, Globalization could also be interpreted as the growing inability of a sovereign to keep out unwanted signals and information. It may mean the development of an international regime and international norms, for example, human rights, to prevent a sovereign from excluding information even when it is technically capable of doing so. So, a lot is contained in these statements. Any comment or thoughts, questions?
Monroe in his book, he refers to not Uruguay's work, but Uruguay's response to the entire thing, rather than relying more on state, he is relying more on industry bodies. And here he says if Canada wants to maintain its cultural autonomy, he is delegating that responsibility to the industrial complex. There has to be an industrial policy.
Right.
So somewhere I'm just trying to understand against this backdrop where we are talking about sovereignty, how can you delegate the entire responsibility to the industrial complex? And then how much autonomy that industrial complex really has?
And I suppose since Mark Rabois is Canadian and he's arguing from Canada, that influences his argument because Canada is a weak country next to the US. They are dominated by US culture, which they are trying to resist. Right? They are subsidizing their culture industries to create some bubble of Canadian identity. Right? And he may be expecting that Canadian industries can be influenced by policy and by nationalism, whatever it is, to form such a body. Yeah, but it's not clear how that will travel, how well that will travel. Yeah. Yeah. And, no, I have a question. How does Monroe Price want us to define globalization? Here he's talking about various effects of globalization. But what is globalization? He doesn't define it. Yeah? And essentially it's whatever happens. It's whatever happens. You know? But we can be more precise. Say this is about the market. You know? And in that sense, it immediately becomes a little more, you can say, political. Yeah, when you say market, then it's like, okay, then that's regulation. Globalization, it's like, you know, some weather. You know, you can't do anything about it. Yeah.
So is it also coming from the experiences of US in the era of globalization? Because he gives an example of Al Jazeera.
Yes.
And he says that Al Jazeera was requested,
Yes.
or there was a negotiation
Yes.
with the government of Qatar where
Yes.
they were requested to not show, I think, Osama bin Laden's videos.
Correct.
But that didn't happen. They kept showing.
And they were bombed.
Yeah.
Which he does not, I mean, his bombing is
Yes.
he doesn't mention it in connection with this.
But he also mentions that there were several requests to other organizations also, media organizations across the globe where I think defense secretary or someone called them saying that don't show Osama bin Laden's videos. But and this, I think this position that America is put in where though they have controlled the flow of information for so long, but they are still in a position. Is it because of the globalization that has happened in nobody was budging, everybody was showing the videos. So, is he coming from that position? Because all of these definitions are certainly describing what America probably faced after 9/11.
Yeah. I would say he, you know, is some positions of the United States he questions. A lot of them he adopts, you know, but he's trying to, above all, he's trying to be neutral. He's like the lawgiver. He's describing things in a way you cannot say no to. That's his aim. Yeah. So, and he does, I think, fall back on this idea that, you know, you should not exclude information. That recurs even in the last chapter, even in the conclusion. And we could say that is still dodging a very troublesome problem. Just, you know, you may have information that cannot freely circulate for all variety of reasons. And so that problematic character of power, the exercise of power, does remain with us. It just cannot be wished away, thought away. That seems to be the case. And he's here going, therefore, for the easy solution. Yeah? Other questions? So it's 12:11. Should I just power on and go until 1 o'clock, or do you want a break? Well, please let me know. Whatever you say. Sure, okay.
you. I do think I would say.
Hello? Hello? Chalega? Right. Resume. So he's giving us a set of indications of what kinds of outcomes globalization has without, as we pointed out, exactly defining what he wants to understand as globalization. It's understood through its effects, you could say. Globalization could imply a positive aura, hands across the sea, development of a common vocabulary, rendering the distribution of information and entertainment more equitable. You never heard about a right to entertainment, but here it's coming. On the other hand, globalization may be said to mean an overarching umbrella of sameness, at least cultural sameness, in large regions. Yeah, this is cultural imperialism, old arguments, homogenization. More specifically, globalization has been interpreted to mean the spread of a Western media culture, often a US culture of commercialization and consumerism. The scope of certain interpretations sometimes rises to suspicion of a United States imperialistic conspiracy. Okay? Communications globalism as the nefarious construct of corporate investment, converting information into just another set of widgets rather than a glorious basis for national identity. Maybe I pause here. Any comments on this very interesting passage? Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yes.
Slowly and gradually we have moved away from being a monopolar society to multipolar world. Where
Multiple.
China and Russia now they are creating their own nest. Then America is afraid because the entire AI revolution is dependent on chips.
Yeah.
And Taiwan is a epicenter of the entire manufacturing, and
Yeah.
China is eyeing on that.
Yes.
And one of the response to that, majority of the semiconductor manufacturer it has moved. USA is relying on home. There are several printer schemes were announced.
Yeah.
So my question in this context is, in the text somewhere I felt that maybe because it is written in early 21st century, the very inclusion of new media and the challenge which are imposed by other facets of the world which are creating their own dominance.
Yeah.
So somewhere it's a very US centric view which is prevalent in the text, and other opposing forces are not discussed much. So
forces such as national forces or technological forces?
technological forces.
Technological. Such as those enabled through social media.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. And he says that, really broadcasting is the main focus of this book. So he admits that, but he acknowledges that internet is changing this situation. Right? But no, it's just that, well, Any other thoughts about this passage? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
into something for protecting the rights of fascism and non-nuclear, controlling communication, and then, sorry, by encouraging free flow of information and passing it to the public as something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, although it's exhaustively footnoted and citations are very comprehensive, Herbert Schiller is missing. I believe Herbert Schiller is missing. Is anyone you saw it? I mean, so the thing is that what does he think? It's always like other people say, other people think, so this not specifying what his position is sometimes it allows him to be evasive, elusive, and that's a characteristic we see across the text. Anyway, so then once you say conspiracy, that means you're poo-pooing the idea immediately, that kind of, so the use of language here is interesting. It's a serious proposition. It's not some wild-eyed theory, right? It's a serious proposition. Satellites surrealistically extend invisible footprints that rechart and re-image areas of the world's surface. Globalization is said to imply the end of the nation state, deprived of control over its information space. Yeah? And against this view, essentially, Monroe Price wants to argue that we should retain the nation state. It should be a locus of negotiation, control that would make the world order more rational. That's, I think, his contribution. Maybe. Yeah.
And the privatization, because of that globalization started, but limited resource of the content, and that was the government controlled only. We will do only the few kind of the licenses.
Yeah.
Got the license from, I think, Sony and other ones. Other haven't got, because is there any kind of the conspiracy behind it, or what kind of in India?
Right. You're asking, were there secret agreements? Yeah. I'm not in a position to answer. But we can't dismiss the possibilities, what you're saying. And I would agree.
And afterwards, in 1996 and 2000, lot of the channels came with me and others, and they gave me the business. But initially, that was there.
Yes, that's right. Until the case that we just heard about, 95, landmark case. Yeah. Right. So another definition, or portrayal of outcome: globalization is the radical increase in the technical, economic, and political costs of territorializing information. Again, this is a very useful definition, I would say. This is a definition without specifying, it could go further, but the widespread remapping of media laws is not new, though its current form, born out of the peculiar globalness of our era, is distinctive. What does he mean by peculiar globalness? And we could maybe, can I ask? What do you think this peculiar globalness might mean? What guesses do you have about what he might be referring to, writing in 2002, publishing in 2002? Why peculiar? Foreign terrorism, very good, absolutely. 9/11, that's right, yeah. So a world at war with itself, right? So not your harmonious picture of before, right? Clash of civilizations already that had been announced, yeah. Samuel Huntington. Yeah, so, he's, yeah, you know, the word peculiar in the US context, the way in which black-white relations are spoken about in the United States is always in terms of a peculiar intimacy. Peculiar intimacy. Why peculiar? Because of the extensive racial intermixture, right? There are very, very, very few African Americans who are, so to say, 100% genetic stock from the continent of Africa, right? Extensively, the white people are partly African American people are almost all partly white, extensively. And yet, the hostility is so intense, yeah? That's why peculiar intimacy is a phrase that kind of euphemism, right? To refer to this both conflict and unacknowledged, you know, sharing. So I'm reminded of that when he speaks about peculiar globalness refers to hidden conflict, in fact, and that's what he's doing. Yeah. Every new medium, every new technology for transmitting information causes responses by those who feel threatened. A half millennium ago, revolutions in print caused fears over dominion and sovereignty, and those in control responded. Yeah, so the response, of course, was ferocious on the part of the church. Yeah, the Inquisition was launched. People were burnt at the stake. Yeah, the Catholic Church had a counter-revolution, the Jesuitical counter-revolution, reassertion of faith. In the arts, it created the Baroque movement, which was a conservative, artistic movement, which became more ornate, more elaborate, more about the privilege of the church, actually. Yeah. So, so he's referring to a lot of things here. This, those in control responded. Yeah, there's a lot contained in that phrase. Even before print, when graven images held great sway, iconoclasts imposed a law of their own. Any comments? What is he talking about here? The bonding of religion and state meant prohibitions too on symbols of those whose faiths were found discordant. Yeah? So he's referring to the, you know, I think is it in the Ten Commandments, is it commandment number 2 or 3 or 4, that, you know, thou shalt not worship graven images, yeah? And that has always been presented as a rational response to this tendency to bow down before, you know, the golden calf or some other false image of, you know, piety, misleading the masses, so to say, and to have no image at all is superior. It was there right in, you know, the Ten Commandments, and then again Protestant Revolution, and before that the Prophet Muhammad, right? That thou shalt not worship graven images was taken very, very seriously. And it's, you may say that it's rational to say no images, only, you know, ideas, but these decisions were always taken in a context of conflict. There is an existing religion which is powerful, which is controlling the image domain, and you cannot enter that image domain with some counter image because already, you know, they've locked up the image markets. The tastes are all going to their side. So the response was no images at all. I mean, we can hypothesize, yeah? And the restriction on images, of course, disappeared without any protest with the broadcasting age. Now, if iconophilia is the law of the age, you might say, yeah? And no mention of that, yeah? So again, so much history contained in these passing remarks, yeah? Radio intrinsically knew no political boundaries until it was tamed and domesticated. And the domestication also involved modifying the technology of radio, which contained the possibility of two-way, right, broadcasting and reception. But the radio receivers that were built and circulated were deprived of the transmitting capacity. It was technologically already available, but they removed it. Yeah? And so that was part of the domestication. The 1920s and 30s were chapters in regulatory history that confirmed state interests in maintaining control of information flows within their boundaries, though even then, the growth of propaganda underscored other potentials for the radio medium. Here he's gesturing to the booming of propaganda in the United States, but also in Europe with various conservative kind of forces. By the 1970s, satellite distribution of signals presented what seemed a decisive moment in the sundering of political lines, yeah, because all previous boundaries were rendered nugatory by the capacity to broadcast across them. Now the internet, with its silent, abundant ubiquity, seems the capstone of this tendency to obliterate borders. Yeah, and we can contemplate that it's exactly when borders are most threatened that the demand for borders is most intense. That's what we're experiencing today, right? They're actually rendered vaporous, and that's precisely when all of our, attention is urged to make them more important, more central to our identity, etc. That's a paradox we have to understand. Pause here. Any questions or comments? I've only gone through a third of my slides. I've got about 77. So I don't think we're going to make it by 1 o'clock. But fortunately, we have today and tomorrow. And so, right. Central to much of modern scholarship is the idea that modern technologies can be, in Ithiel de Solapool's memorable phrase, technologies of freedom. Maybe you've heard this phrase, but it was indeed became a slogan. Ithiel de Solapool was one of the many scholars who was a Cold Warrior. Yeah, he was very much involved in psychological warfare, psychological operations, and then sort of moved to writing about the spread of technology in this kind of way, essentially promoting the spread of media. Technologies of freedom were called such precisely because of the capacity to overwhelm boundaries, whether physical or legislative. And as a result, they become key to the spread of democracy. Okay, so here it's a different tone from some of the other statements he's already made, where he's saying it's creating problems, the state will have to decide what to do, how will sovereignty and identity converge, now, it's going to be more coercion. Here suddenly he takes it. So it's an unresolved question for him, it seems like. He's not being quite consistent on this issue. Yeah? Political transitions now taking place seem clear manifestations of this view. Technologies of freedom are the stuff of every morning's news, new generations of satellites, the promise of far more abundant telephony, signals reverberating around the globe. Almost everywhere, national borders are increasingly irrelevant, and technology traverses boundaries so effectively that it continues to confound current modes of media and political organization. So, certain amount of repetition is there here. Yeah. Huh. Yes, yes. Uh-huh.
So again, it was very interesting because ISRO and NASA, they had joined hands.
Yes.
And then Everett Rogers and all those people, they had specifically come they're focusing on
Wilbur Schramm, I don't know if I ever told you. Wilbur Schramm.
Domination. Obviously, he had come to India and then visited some parts of Gujarat. And then
No, he oversaw the social science effects research for sites.
And then everybody had huge expectation from the project. But when I was reading a report, that report that was very interesting light, and in today's theoretical framework also, they call site project as a technological success,
Yeah.
hardware success, or software failure. And they call it software failure because the agenda which government has imposed,
Yeah,
that was not something people were expecting.
yeah.
So somewhere again it resonates with what we are discussing here.
Mm.
Again there is a clearly defined state-led agenda, and sometimes what happens, what people are expecting.
What was the, what are you saying with the state agenda?
State agenda, because government, they took a very patronizing view. The
Mm.
idea was to inform people, to educate people.
Yeah.
And then people were expecting entertainment. And that way they simply could not connect with the program.
Right.
So as a technology, the project becomes successful. That now what you are doing through satellite, you are distributing information to the grassroots, and that to 6 different states altogether. But the real effect,
Yeah.
or the social mobilization, all the literacy awareness, all those goals were not achieved.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing that you speak to Vinod Agarwal, who actually ran the FX research. He's in Ahmedabad.
Right.
Still happy to talk to people and so on. He says they did not stress, they didn't put enough effort into the software, and that was the reason for the failure. That they were mainly interested in the hardware. They wanted to be able to reach across the country. That they managed to do. What was going to be programmed was not, they didn't pay much attention to it actually. You know, so that finally the Hindi films were the most popular. You know.
And same observations, again they are resonating subsequent work also, because P.C. Joshi committee,
Yes.
they also suggested Doordarshan, Prasar Bharati back then, they had to do some serious introspection.
An Indian identity for Doordarshan. It's the
Indian
title of
identity,
this.
exactly. So
I think
they had-
dated 1985.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you look at this previous paper which I mentioned, Susu's Murdochization of news.
Ah.
So again,
Right.
he says that Doordarshan was there, but the advent of Star and Sony, and those news become even more popular because they had focused on 3 C's: crime, cricket, and cinema. And because audiences had been interested in that, and this is how Western thought and capitalist and consumer thought was imposed on audiences, and audiences also kind of accepted it.
Yeah. In Times of India, they said ABC, astrology, Bollywood, cricket. And reporters complained, but you know that was driven by the Jain brothers.
And same P.C. Joshi, he was extremely critical of the success of Kaun Banega Crorepati. Because in Kaun Banega Crorepati promos,
Yeah.
there was this very interesting promo line, Gyan hi aapka hak dilata hai. And then P.C. Joshi said, what you are selling is information, and real knowledge and information are 2 different things altogether.
Yes.
And then you are fooling the entire nation by calling
Yes.
Gyan as information, and this is mis-selling.
Yes. Very good point. Very good point. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, we can talk more about site. I also spent a little time looking at it. States have national security needs. These two, as we have seen, the wake of September 11, have radically transformative consequences for media policies. It's vital to examine complexities and contradictions in Western attitudes toward unmediated distribution of information, the historic problem of oscillating between demands for freedom and concern over content. Okay, so there's a little bit of fudging going on here because it was not the Western attitude, it was the United States attitude, which then, after more than 2 decades, it took them more than 2 decades to win over Europe so that they could then say the West. So that achievement of making it the West was, by no means guaranteed. Yeah? But this is a very good point. We do not yet know what constitutes an ideal global republic of information. We do not yet know what constitutes an ideal global republic of information. Again, I would like to ask any thoughts about this? comment, however wild. Ah. Ah. Yeah.
Leader of the world, etc., something like that. The idea that internet can make informed, denizens.
Yeah.
So,
And what does it mean to think like a lawyer?
well, to think in terms of institutions and laws, primarily as the mode of mediation between complex problems and complex solutions. To kind of look at people as governable, or at least as some entity that can be organized
Yeah.
for the betterment of some goal.
Yeah.
So I would say I think this is, and it's a because this Republic of Information, I mean it's kind of kind of an oxymoron, because to govern information, it's a very it's a very complicated process.
Which goes back to Anil's point about knowledge.
Yeah.
That's a more salient
Yeah.
definition. Information does not lead to wisdom.
Yeah.
Knowledge can lead to wisdom. Information can lead to confusion. We're all experiencing it. Right? Yeah. But I'm struck by the fact that there is not a clear sense of where they are going.
Yeah.
They're making all these arguments. They're saying this is wrong, that should right, this should be done, that. But they don't know where they're going. They don't have a model. They don't have a map. And it is admitted in passing. In passing. So you can say that's unavoidable, problems are too hard, but it is still striking that you can have so much argument without a model. Because of course he's disavowing every position. It's like other people think this, other people think that. So anyway, this is something we'll come back to. Given the active strategies of states responding to challenges to their authority in a post-global age, those who ring the death knell of the state may ring too soon. Fine, yes. You hear about the retreat of the state, the withdrawal of the state. What the state is doing is becoming stronger, more coercive, more selective in its coercion. That's the point. Much more selective in its coercion. So this is quite right. At the same time that the function of the state and its capacity to describe and enforce law is brought into doubt, lawmaking and the invocation of the need and power to control imagery increase. Again, this kind of paradox is terribly interesting, just as borders become more important when they are harder to achieve. Law becomes more important when it is harder to achieve. Yeah, so that paradox we have to grasp, because we can have a better understanding of the internal conflicts behind positions that tend to be taken. There must be this law or this identity, or, that in fact it's in the context where it's harder and harder to achieve that law, to achieve a certain identity. So then you may be implicitly sanctioning a wholly new set of conditions to enable what you have said must be had. But you're not examining the conditions for that. This is the point. Unless you examine the conditions, then your understanding is incomplete. At the same time, the function of the state and its capacity to yes, right. A disparagement of the capacity of law on the one hand, and the widespread turn to invoking law on the other. There is something remarkable about it. The market is so powerful, technology so ubiquitous, that we are often reminded that the process of lawmaking, especially in the field of media regulation, is like building castles in the sand, where complex structures will be forcefully erased by an overwhelming cascade of waves. Quite true. Yet simultaneously, there is a passion for moral controls, for regulation of indecency, and for restoring some sense of an order and security. Okay? He is in fact outlining here the move to a conservative position, because when you say morals, there is never an argument. There's only right and wrong. The whole point of politics is to say what should be right and what should be wrong in a given context with given constraints. But invocation of morality means no argument is allowed. He may be correct that that is the response, but he is uncritical about why should there be that response. Yeah? And this refers to some of our discussions yesterday, which we can clarify in the Q&A section. Political boundaries. This will be my last slide for lunch. Then we can have Q&A until we break for lunch. Political boundaries affect media boundaries, and the opposite is true as well. The radical changes in the media map will alter the physical map in ways yet unknown. Very interesting. What do you think about that? Any comment or thoughts about it? The radical changes in the media map will alter the physical map in ways yet unknown. So here we are in India, we're watching Johnny Depp and his domestic problems. We absorb the internal problems of the United States as if they affected us. And maybe that will spur a desire to move to the United States, where we can align our internal and external environments. Yeah, so it spurs free flow of information may have, from the US perspective, wholly undesirable effects, right, which they've themselves not figured out, because they still want that. If the footprint of a satellite is not the footprint of a country, well then that is immediately changing the cultural boundaries, right, that people are subject to. So where is that going to go? So he's right, yes, it is absolutely unknown. Military strategies, business planning, international diplomacy, the work of scholars and politicians are all conducted in the shadow of this process of change. Again, a very, very strong statement about the enormous power of media, and by implication, the enormous neglect of media in virtually all the social sciences, corresponding to a long-standing trivialization, right? No effects. What are the effects? No effects. That was even when I went to college, that's what one was hearing. Yeah? So a long-standing erasure of the question of media impact, which is belatedly at the end of the Cold War, right, coming up as a, but without noting that there is 40 years of blurring the problem of media before that. Right? No mention of that whatsoever. On the contrary, his blurb for the book comes from Elihu Katz. And now something very characteristic in any field of research. When the change happens, you deny that it is change. You pretend nothing has changed. And these authors are demonstrating that for our benefit. Yeah? So, in a sense, we have to be very vigilant in understanding historical change, because if we try to say where is the break point, we cannot take people, the actors' testimony at face value. Usually they are invested in some way of thinking about it. We cannot take that for granted. For all these actors and observers, precisely because so much turns on assumptions about the flow of information, the contours of transformations in the media, and their relationship to the power of the state ought to be more closely examined. That's the next few chapters, but then after the break we'll talk about chapter 9, where it kind of brings it all together. Yeah? Questions, comments?
control, and then there are certain subgroups obviously who were resisting it. Then we also had farmer protests.
Yes.
And interestingly, in farmer protests, the first support came from international celebrities. And then obviously then Indian celebrity who kind of defended government. So again, it very resonates very well with this particular framework where we are discussing that a nation's issue is no more a nation's issue, and then it becomes a global spectacle. And beyond the point, it becomes clash of ideologies.
Yes.
So fantasy of this sovereignty is there, right, sir? And the state tries to portray itself in the control, but at the same time, this big corporation, all whether it is Google or Meta, are more powerful also. So, sir, when state act itself is in power or in control, and we saw like whatever the conversations and recent times between GUI and Meta, GUI and Twitter and all that. So, is it, sir, is it because of course states care, those companies care for the profits, but here and state also, isn't it state just creating narrative more than the sovereignty, more than
This deserves a longer discussion. But I would just say very quickly, can there be sovereignty without a narrative? But that's a very good question in politics. Yeah. Contribute in what way? Support.
Support, or to have an opinion about the situation, where it's expected for the society from these public figures to have an opinion on such things. So they are sometimes forced to contribute or to share their opinion on public platforms, which
Yes.
makes it even more of an issue. I would say issue, but it amplifies the entire thing.
Yeah. Can you, is there an example that comes to mind?
Not in particular, but I can't think of anything in particular, but if there's an issue that is happening, then it is always in interviews or in media interactions, public figures are expected to have an opinion or
Yes.
give their
Yes.
viewpoint on that particular issue.
Yes.
Even though if they don't want to contribute, in order to avoid any problems that they might face on an individual level, they are still forced in some way to comment on such issues.
I mean, there's a couple of people. One is the confirmation bias. So, survey researchers have noted that in traditional contexts such as India, and you may have experienced this in your own research fieldwork, when you ask them, you're talking to some, say, people in some community, ask them a question, they want to know what you think they should say. And they're happy to give you the answer, that's just the courtesy. So, so there's that confirmation bias that courtesy produces. And then there's the expectation that everybody, as you say, ought to have an opinion. They may not have an opinion. Right? So the demand that they have to produce an opinion, well, it's easiest to produce an opinion that conforms and they stay out of trouble. Yeah? But then there's also this, I don't know, just something that the driver who brought me to the university today, he called me, and the picture on the phone was two children, his two children, wearing T-shirts saying, "I love India." That's the mark of the times. One did not see that some time ago. Now you see that. So membership is being signaled in ways that are legible, immediately legible. It's in English, and it's signaling membership in a community. It's something approvable. You know, it's whereas previously that may not have mattered at all. Yeah, so that's a sort of, could say enlargement of boundaries, but it's also a kind of homogenization. You know, interesting. Yes. 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 Yes, yes. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Of course. Of course. Yes. Very much so. Very much so. Yeah. Did you have?
Not questions, but I just wanted some clarification regarding last year there was a film for the Kashmir Files, and the government gave a lot of the access, and the theater was open for this to broadcast that film. And the producer and director met to the Prime Minister, and they had a discussion. But apart from that, other films, Kerala Files and other
Kerala Story.
Kerala Stories, they were they haven't got the theaters also. In Maharashtra also, one film was there, Shivaji. So they haven't got the theaters in regional also. But how it me? I want to know how it is it the political, legal, the leading the ideologies or giving the access to such a kind of the content they want to make the narrative in the society? What?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure those concerns are there. I mean, when during the emergency, there was a filmmaker who made this film from Indus Valley to Indira Gandhi. Okay, Indus Valley to Indira Gandhi. So she was like the height, the summit of 5,000-year-long process, and that film got tax exemption. You know, we were all encouraged to see it, and you know, for a few paise you could go and watch. So yes, of course, it's always been there, and question is how they do it and what the outcomes are. Yeah, so opens up other questions. Fact that the state wants to control the narrative, of course, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. Mm-hmm. Which one? Ah, right. Yeah. Yeah. So that you know, again, we can return to that after the break, ke baad. Okay.